Welcome to the Family Brand Podcast. Today I have Suzette Halterman. Thank you, Suzette, for joining me today.
I'm excited to be here.
Suzette is amazing. I had the chance to meet her virtually. I think you bought our Family Brand program, I think is initially how we were connected. And then you had a great experience with it. And you said, I want to bring this to my community. Suzette is a certified relationship coach. And so we did a webinar for her community, and it was so fun to be able to collaborate on that with you and meet some of your community. So we go back like 6 months, Suzette and I.
I know, tight.
So I brought Suzette on. As I said, she is a relationship coach. And I had someone reach out recently who said, can you do a podcast episode on the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? Is that what they're called?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
By the Gottman Institute. And so I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, but I know someone who I had been wanting to have on the podcast anyway. So Suzette, welcome again. And can you tell us a little bit about maybe yourself and your family to get started?
Yeah, I've got 4 kids, and my youngest is 8. My oldest is 14. I live in a small mountain town of Colorado, tiny town. So I do a lot of my work virtually, and I work with couples, mostly couples, and who are navigating differences of different kinds. And I love working with couples, and I've trained at the Gottman Institute. So I do know a lot about the 4 horsemen, and I'm really excited to talk about them because I think it's a really important topic for people to understand. And I don't think most people really understand. A lot of people have heard about it, but they don't understand the important parts about them.
Yeah, I know I don't. So I'm excited to learn from you today. Tell me, how did you get into doing couples coaching?
I was trained as a marriage and family therapist a long time ago, and then I took a break raising my kids, and I kind of got back into it. And I just liked, I didn't know if I wanted to go the therapist path, the coach's path, but I just liked the coaching path better for lots of reasons. For me personally, it's just a better fit for the fact that I work virtually instead of in person, because I live in a tiny town. So it's always been a passion of mine, and I just love working with couples. It's very fulfilling. It's fun. It's never dull. I can say that for sure.
Yes. Okay. Tell me a little bit, if a listener were hearing the word, the Gottmans or the Gottman Institute for the first time, you mentioned you were trained in their philosophies. Will you tell us a little bit about who the Gottmans are and what the Gottman Institute is?
Yes. So John Gottman has done a lot for the field of research around relationships and couples in particular. He was actually a mathematician, and he taught math, and he did a lot of research for like physics and engineering. And then he ended up also getting a psychology degree. And so because he loves research, he brought research into the field of psychology and relationships, because there just wasn't a lot of science and data. It was more observational, kind of anecdotal. So he did a lot for helping us understand with data about couples and what makes marriages thrive, what makes marriages fail. And that was huge. His data disproved a lot of the theories about what makes relationships successful or not. And it was helpful in guiding kind of other therapists, family therapists, to know how best to help their couples. And then he married a therapist. So they kind of combined his research with her clinical skills and created a whole way of working with couples, formed the Gottman Institute, and they train therapists and coaches, and they have courses, and they have a ton of stuff. So it's kind of grown, and they've written books, and so that's about them.
And I think I remember reading that they had like a research facility where they would actually bring in real life couples.
Yes.
And observe them.
Yes. Because you think well, how do you get actual hard data on couples? So they created the Love Lab, is what they called it. It's basically an apartment, and people would come stay for 24 hours. Couples would come stay, but there was cameras bolted on all the walls. They would hook them up to monitors. They would take every time they used the bathroom, they would take samples of their urine. So they would use urine samples for like testing different things, and they would take blood samples. So they were testing for stress hormones, immune system function. They were monitoring heart rates, and then they were recording everything. And then they had people who are trained in like coding facial expressions, like analyzing every single element of every conversation they had, because there's a whole science. Like we can only convey our emotions through so many facial movements, and there's a science to that. Like one raised eyebrow here and a lip twitch here is a signal of this emotion. So they coded all of the emotions. They like analyzed, they took note of what words were said and tone and like everything to get a really big picture. So yeah, that's the love lab. That's how they gathered all the data. And then they would follow up with these couples. Where were they 3 months, down the road, 6 months, whatever. And that is how he compiled a lot of formulas to predict, like couples who do this end up here and couples who do this end up here. So it's really interesting.
That is so interesting. And just that observation in a 24-hour period, he developed enough research to be able to say, like, the likelihood of what we observed here is that they're going to be here in 3 to 6 months.
Right. He did it over and over with, thousands and thousands of couples over, like, I can't remember, like 32 years or something. So, and they're still doing it, but now they can do it. There's virtual labs because we have a lot more technology for those things. But yeah, so it became a very accurate predictor. His formulas, like couples who do this, it's like, I can't remember the exact number, but it's like a 90-something% prediction accuracy. So it's pretty impressive.
And is that what the four horsemen are?
Yes. So 4 horsemen are one of the predictors of divorce. There's a few. Well, I think there's like 6 official, but the 4 horsemen is one predictor of divorce, and not just of divorce, but of relationship satisfaction. Because some people can be miserable, but they never pull the plug and get divorced. So, but yes, the 4 horsemen are that. And he calls them the 4 horsemen because they're 4 behaviors that all go together. And it's in reference to the Bible, the book of Revelations. There's 4 horsemen that ride before the end of the world. So that's why he called these the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, because they're riding before the end of the marriage. Like if you see them, you know that like the end is coming, basically, is what it's in reference to.
That's a funny, I don't know why that name kind of makes me laugh. Like 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Okay, so let's just jump in. What are 4 horsemen of the apocalypse?
Yes. So the criticism is the first one. Defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. And I'll go into each of these more specifically, but those are the 4. So do you want me to just go into each one?
Yeah, please do. Yeah, let's just start with some description of them.
Yeah. So criticism is when you're pointing your finger at your partner, basically, and telling them all the ways they are defective in the relationship. So, you always, you never, like you're complaining about the ways that they are the problem, basically. And it's not that somebody's doing that out of meanness. It's that we really think that that's going to help. Right? Like, you never clean anything, like your room, you always leave your laundry. We usually criticize because we're trying to get our partner to change. It's very normal behavior. And so it's not that if someone is critical or criticizes from time to time that, that's a 4 horsemen, that means divorce. The problem with criticism is that it invites more of the 4 horsemen in, because if someone is critical of you, you're not just going to respond with, oh, thank you so much. Yes, I think I will do things differently, right? Like that's in our dream world. That's what we're hoping for, but like it never happens that way. So criticism is a 4 horsemen because it invites more deadlier horsemen. It's kind of like sometimes the first of the 4 horsemen to show up. So it's not deadly in and of itself, but it invites the next of the 4 horsemen, which is defensiveness. So if somebody's attacking your character, because criticism is, it's very much attacking the character. Again, it's here's the way you're defective. That's going to invite defensiveness, and defensiveness can go one of 2 ways. It's either a counterattack, like, Oh, you say I'm messy, you're messy, right? Like
Mhm.
I see my kids do this all the time. Kids are great at defensiveness. It's like, no, you're dumb, no, your feet
You're
smell. Like,
dumber.
right, exactly. Like we do this as adults, just usually kinder language. But so defensiveness can be either like a counterattack or it's like innocent victim. Like I never do that. Like that wasn't what I meant, like that wasn't my intention. So we become either like we're innocent or we counterattack. And so defensiveness doesn't work either because it escalates the problem usually. So if you're defensive, what's that going to invite in the interaction? It's going to invite, if you're counterattacking, well, it's just inviting in an escalation, more criticism, more defensiveness. If you're the innocent victim, well, then that makes the other person feel like they're not being heard or understood. So it's going to escalate. It amps up the problem. And that's the four horsemen are problematic because they escalate the negativity. And that's why they're so problematic. They're not behaviors that calm things down or create more functional problem solving. They escalate the negativity. And that was another one of Gottman's findings, that positivity is critical in relationships. Like you need more positive interactions than negative interactions. You need 20 to 1. So
Wow.
20 positive interactions for every one negative interaction. And in conflict, you need 5 positive interactions for every one negative interaction. So even in like difficult conversations, you still have to have more positivity than negativity. And the four horsemen they just like suck away all the positive interaction and they bring on all the negative interaction. And then it's really problematic. So those are the first two, criticism and defensiveness. Stonewalling is the next one. And stonewalling is really just like a measure of emotional withdrawal. So it's like when you're talking to somebody, but they're not giving you any vocalization that they're following you. So there's no like, yeah, like I get it. They're not saying anything and they're not like nodding their head. They're not following you. So it could look like they're just turning away from you. They're doing something else, kind of like they're ignoring you. So it's like you're talking to a wall. That's why it's called stonewalling. Like you're not getting responsiveness back. And to the person receiving that, it feels like disapproval. To the speaker, that feels like disapproval. And it amps up our nervous system. And it feels like, so then we're probably going to go into more criticism, right? Like if you're not talking to me, I'm going to start to feel more critical, or I might get defensive and I might start, or I might stonewall back. Like, so it doesn't invite it. Again, it escalates negativity. It doesn't invite any healthy conflict management. And usually the person stonewalling is not doing it to be mean or like cruel. They're thinking, if I just like don't interact, that maybe this will go away, is what's going on in their head. Like if I just don't acknowledge that this is happening, if I don't say anything, then maybe it'll blow over. So it's their method of trying to make things better, just like people who criticize are trying to make things better, but it never works because we have a psychological response to that, to not like being met with any kind of anything. You can see this, babies do the same thing. So if you Google the still face experiment, they do this with babies. Like they'll have the mom like talk to the baby and then like make their face go totally still. So they're not like giving any reciprocation to the baby. And you can see the baby start to amp up and escalate and use all these negative strategies to like try to get the parents' attention. So it's it's a psychological response that we have. Even babies have it.
Yeah.
We have it as adults. Like if we're not being met with some sort of interaction, then we kind of go crazy in our heads and we escalate in our reactivity and in our negativity. What's interesting about stonewalling is that it's in heterosexual relationships, it's something like 85% of the time it's males who do this. And in heterosexual relationships, it's females who are mostly doing the criticizing. So it is very along gender lines. So, which is interesting. And in this his data, he found that what's causing stonewalling is when people's heart rate gets above 100 beats per minute, they found within 10 seconds, they would stonewall. So it's really a psychological response. Like I'm getting really amped up, so I end up stonewalling as a way to deal with that. And so I'll talk in a minute about what to do instead of all these four horsemen, but that's where it comes from. It's like just a response to like being really amped up for some people, particularly men, as they kind of shut down, they withdraw, and it really just amps up their partner who's on the receiving end of that.
Yeah, I could see that. If you're, I mean, this is all happening, you're probably not even aware of it, but it's like,
Yep.
I'm getting anxious, my heart is beating faster. It seems like the best response might be to like shut down.
Yes.
I could see like how that would play out. Totally.
Yep. My son does this, right? Male. He does it with headphones. They're like, oh, mom's talking to me. I'm getting annoyed. Boop, headphones go on. And I'm like, that's stonewalling. And I like get all amped up. But yeah, it happens really fast for us. It's very automatic. So the last of the four horsemen and the deadliest is contempt. And that is a feeling of like superiority. You're speaking from a place of like being better than, smarter than, more informed than, like I'm more intelligent, I'm better than, I'm neater than you. It's a position of superiority. And what that looks like in couples is insults. Like I'm going to throw some insults at you, mocking, sarcasm, like body language of like eye rolling. I see eye rolling a lot in couples, or kind of just like, that kind of like sound of, kind of scoffing body language. Those are all forms of contempt. And contempt is the best predictor of divorce. So if you have contempt, that also likely means that all the other horsemen are there. That's probably what brought contempt in, right? If there's enough criticism and defense and stonewalling over and over, it's going to build into contempt eventually. So if contempt is there, like, oh, this is bad news. Like we're not in a good place. And yeah, it's the single greatest predictor of divorce. So that really has to be eliminated quickly if that presents itself in a relationship. And that the reason for that is because you can't have intimacy and connection if you're not viewing each other as like same as, like if you're not seeing each other as equals, it's really hard to have connection and intimacy if one person is feeling like they're better than or superior to, and like the other person is just, not good enough for them. You can't build a relationship on that, which is why it usually ends up in divorce.
I've done some, actually I had her on the podcast a few months ago, was Jennifer Finlayson-Fife.
Mm-hmm.
She talks about this. I think this is what you're describing, how sometimes you get into a relationship and you have someone that's always one up and someone one down, but you kind of, as she describes her, is you might kind of live there like a lot of your relationship, maybe not even recognizing it. But even the one down person, they can kind of exist there because they have some sort of power like in that lower position, which I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. No, and that comes from Terry Real. He's a therapist, and that's his language of one up and one down. And it's the same thing. And he says you cannot have a relationship unless it's same as, right? That both people have to you either have to come down from your one up position, or you have to come up from your one down position to really create a thriving relationship. So same idea, different language.
Yes. Yeah, I love that. The thought of that, like, am I in my relationship? Are we presenting as equals?
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Okay. So if I'm like listening to this and I'm like, oh no, like, am I doing any one of these things? Is our relationship doomed? Help me, Suzette. Like what?
Okay.
I'm sure other people listening are thinking the same thing.
Yes.
Is this coming up?
We all do these things. The goal is to be aware of them and try to stop them again, because the problem with the four horsemen is that they invite the other four horsemen. So stopping them before the negativity escalates is the goal. So I'll go through all of them and tell you what to do instead. Like if you find that, so let's say you are one who's prone to criticism. That's me. That's my four horsemen that I'm more prone to. So Gottman divides these into like the masters versus the disasters of the relationship. So disasters, or high risk for divorce people, use a lot of criticism. People who are low risk or masters, they point the fingers at themselves. So instead of like, it's not really pointing fingers, they focus on themselves instead of the other person, and they make requests from the I. So instead of, you never help me with the kids, it's like, I am feeling, or I'm thinking, or I'm perceiving, right? So you're focusing inward on what is happening with you. I'm feeling really unsupported right now. And then you make a request instead of a complaint. Criticism is all complaint. And what you want to do, like, I'm feeling unsupported. I would love it if you could pitch in and help me out with the kids right now, right? Totally different feel. That is responsible, what we call responsible complaining, instead of like irresponsible complaining, which is like, you never help me and blah, 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 right? So we want to focus inward. The other part of criticism is you're minimizing, or the other antidote to criticism is you're minimizing intensity. So you're not making it like, this is a huge thing that's destroying our marriage. It's like, I love 99 things about you. This one thing is kind of bothersome, so I'm not going to make a huge deal, but I'm going to request. So, I feel whatever. I feel anxious when you're spending money without talking to me. I would love if we could sit down and compromise around our budget, So that's not criticism. That's just requesting something. And the reason that we don't do that as easily as humans is because there's a lot more vulnerability when we request something, because it sets us up for, they could reject that. They could choose not to, right? Complaining, there's no vulnerability in complaining and criticizing. Like, you spend too much money, you never help with stuff. Like, there's no vulnerability. I'm still totally protected if I just complain. But if I say, I'm feeling really unsupported, I would love it if you would sit down with me and work on this, they could say no to that. They could. And so that's, you can even like feel, if you make a request, you can almost feel like a little bit of exposure, like, oh no, they could reject me. They could say no. It's vulnerable. And that's why our brains don't do that, because our brains don't like to be vulnerable. They're there to protect us and keep us safe. So
I think too, like, as you're describing it, even saying like, I am feeling unsupported, even that I feel is a little bit exposure, as opposed to your other example of you never help with the kids. Like, that's not, you're not even saying, it's not as exposed, I guess, your feelings.
Totally. Yeah. Which is why we don't do that. We like to just keep ourselves safe and protected. So yeah, the opposite of criticism is really being vulnerable, saying how you feel and what you would like, and minimizing the intensity. And Gottman calls that a soft startup. So it's not like harshness, it's vulnerability, it's softness. And it is very vulnerable, but intimacy and connection requires vulnerability. So that's the antidote, the opposite of criticism. Go ahead.
One thing that I have found useful that you've been saying, but maybe I just like to highlight it here, is that those phrases like you always, you never, I feel like those always, I don't know, they feel like, well, usually they're not true. Usually it's not an always or never, but I feel like those do lead to the escalation that you were talking about. So tell me if you disagree, that we've tried to just eliminate those from when we're talking to each other, like you always, you never.
Absolutely. Yes. That's a really good rule of thumb, because you always and you never are pretty indicative of criticism. Like, you can't really not be criticizing if you're using that kind of language.
Yeah.
So absolutely. It's a good point. So if the opposite of defensiveness is taking ownership for even a small part of the problem. So like, for example, I'm a messy cooker. Like, I don't put stuff away as I use it. I make a mess. The other day, my husband came back. He was like helping clean, and he made some remark that was semi-critical about the messes that I make when I was cooking. And I wanted to get defensive, but I remembered this and I just took ownership. And I was like, I struggle with that. I know, like, I'm horrible at cooking cleanly, right? So just taking ownership for what you struggle with instead of getting defensive. So even if somebody comes at you with criticism, you can stop the escalation by just owning, like, yeah, I do struggle with that sometimes. Or even if you feel like you really didn't do something, you can still take ownership for a small part. Like, yeah, maybe I did raise my voice. Maybe I did, instead of just being super defensive about it. And then the other antidote to defensiveness. So you're going to own a little bit, and you're also just going to be curious about the other person, because defensiveness becomes all about me, right? Like, how dare you? But ownership is like, oh, or sorry, not ownership, but being curious about the other person looks more like wondering how you're impacting them. Like, oh, yeah, tell me more about what you're experiencing or what you're feeling, right? Instead of getting defensive about how I'm feeling, I want to get curious about what's going on with you in this moment. So that just, if you're curious about the other person and you're owning your part, like, that just melts away the escalation of them wanting to come back with more defensiveness, more criticism. It opens up dialogue, and that's what we want. We want to open up things instead of just escalate and build negativity.
What's an example of, in that, the example you shared about your cooking, what would being curious, like a curious response, what would that have maybe looked like?
Okay, so I could just be like, I struggle with that. And then I could be like, oh, that must be really hard for you. Because he works night shifts. So he comes, like, I cook breakfast and then I get the kids to school. He comes home and he usually helps clean up before he goes to sleep. So I can just be like, oh, that must really be hard to come home to like a super messy kitchen and you're tired and there's a lot to clean. Like, I get that. Does that make you angry? Does that make you frustrated? So I can ask questions about it. I can put myself in his shoes instead of being like, well, I'm doing all this work to get the kids off to school. And you have no idea how crazy it is in the morning, right? Like, I totally could go that way. And in my head, that's what I was thinking. I was like, you can get 4 kids off to school when one of them is like freaking out about something, right?
Yeah.
So just like, no, like, I can be curious, like, what is that? Are you feeling mad about that? Are you feeling sad? Like, are you feeling just grumpy and tired because you've had a long night at your job? So
okay, yeah, that's
helpful.
helpful.
That helps.
Yeah, totally.
All right. So the antidote to stonewalling is just self-soothing, taking a break. So stonewalling is because your body's getting amped up. So the antidote is to take a break and get yourself calmed down. It can be like just distraction, like looking at your phone, reading, but you're not going to do that while they're trying to talk to you. Like, I'm not going to, scroll on my phone. It's like, hey, like, I'm not in the mood to talk about this right now. Can we talk about it in 30 minutes? I need to decompress. And during that time, you go for a run, you go for a walk, you watch a show, so that your brain gets back into a functional place where you can like face each other and talk about whatever it is instead of needing to like turn away from them. So self-soothing is the antidote of stonewalling. And women whose spouses tend to stonewall need to know that, like, if they ask for a break, you got to give it to them so that then they can come back into a more present place and actually talk with you. So that's stonewalling. And then the antidote to contempt is creating a culture of appreciation. So people who are contemptuous are really scanning the environment and looking for the bad and then criticizing the bad. So the antidote to that is to really scan the environment to what's going well, look for the good, and acknowledge the good. So you're fostering a culture of noticing the good things and appreciating. So you're verbalizing the good things. Respect, creating a culture of respect. So, eliminating all the insults and anything that is coming across as being superior or looking down on. So just cultivating appreciation, respect, fondness, and admiration. And that could be really hard for people who've built up a lot of contempt. It can be really hard to do that. It's almost like a mind shift you have to make to like look for the good. In fact, Gottman found that people who are in a contemptuous place miss about 50% of the good things that are actually happening. So
they don't even see them.
Yeah, they don't even see them. Like, they could, on their videos, watch like a spouse like helping put away groceries or doing something, and the person that's in a place of contempt wouldn't even acknowledge like at least half, if not more. And so the couples that are the disasters of relationships have a lot of contempt. Masters of relationship have almost no contempt. So because they naturally are looking for good, or they're appreciating each other, they have respect. So yeah, so that's the antidote to all of the four horsemen.
This was so fascinating. You said something earlier that I wanted to jump back and ask you about. You said that positivity, that he recommends you have 20-1 interactions, like 20 positive to 1 negative. How would you, and you kind of been describing this a little bit, but how would you say if you realize like we are not having this, that many positive interactions, where the negative are far outweighing the positive?
Yeah.
How would you recommend to couples to maybe begin to increase their positive interactions with each other?
Being really intentional about it. Like, I'm going to, because positive interactions can be like physical touch. Like, I'm going to, touch you on the shoulder as you walk by. It can be humor, playfulness, but it can also just be like asking questions. So you could say, I'm going to ask, instead of always making it about me, I'm going to ask like 10 open-ended questions today. Like, and some spouses don't like, maybe they don't like that, but just finding different things. So curious questions, physical affection, playfulness, humor. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. Just owning your part. That's also a positive interaction. Basically all the things, all the antidotes that we've been talking about, those are positive interactions. And so even just turning towards your partner, that's a Gottman idea. So if they say something, like, you turn your attention towards them and you're interested in it, right? They talk about bread and you're like, oh, what bread are you talking about? Or they're like, remember the time? And you're like, oh yeah. And you engage in conversation. That's turning towards, that's a positive interaction. So every time they speak, just shift your attention to what they're talking about, whether you shift it physically or you acknowledge it like verbally from the other room. That's a positive interaction. So those are just some little things you can do, and those will naturally, and thank yous, right? That's one positive interaction right there. Every time you say thank you for something that they've done, every acknowledgement for something that they've done. So it's just a matter of being intentional and saying, like, I'm going to say thank you 10 times and I'm going to ask 10 questions. Boom, there's 20 positive interactions right there.
I love that. So we talked a little bit before we started recording about how a lot of these things that it's not just in like with couples, for example, that a lot of these coping strategies you can see with children, like in a parent-child relationship or just families in general. Would you have anything to say about that?
Yes, because these are not just between couples. These represent the way we interact and the way we react to situations. So, like, if you're scanning the environment for negative with your spouse, you're probably doing the same thing with your kids. You're scanning for when they make mistakes and you're jumping in with criticism. So you can catch yourself doing that with your kids. Same thing. It's a mindset, and you might be defensive. Like, man, teenagers, like, my teenage boy stonewalls all the time, and that brings out my criticism, right? So it's the same dynamic. Because this is what happens in very underdeveloped nervous systems. This is the way the brain responds: criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling. So you can also be training them by modeling the opposite. Like, if they jump into criticism, right? Because women are more prone to criticism, teenage girls are going to be more critical. So if you have a teenage girl and she's criticizing, you model not being defensive. So you take ownership, you get curious. So you can model these things with your kids. And you can teach them, like, that is criticism and it's not helpful to our conflict management right now, or it's just amping up. You can use these words. When you do this, it's escalating the negativity, and that's not going to get us anywhere. So yeah, we use these same things with our kids. And so it's just noticing and trying to do the opposite of these things with our spouse, with our kids. Because our kids are going to push all of our emotional buttons, and we're going to react in these same ways that we do with our spouse. So it's just being mindful and making efforts to change them in ourselves, and that models something different for our kids.
Would you have any advice for a couple wanting to just improve their marriage in general. Maybe it's not, maybe they feel like they have a fine marriage, but it's like, I think more is possible for us. What would you have any advice to a couple, like how to begin to find that next level in their relationship?
Oh, yeah, that's a big, one of Gottman's things is just to increase the friendship. When you have a good friendship, it really naturally creates a lot of other good things. So he's got a lot of books, The 7 Principles of Making Marriage Work, The Relationship Prescription, or I can't remember what that one's called, but that talks about this. And friendship is just knowing about each other deeply, appreciating each other, valuing each other, enjoying each other's company. So I think you can always, I think it's a never ending task to work on, like building your friendship, right? Because especially if you're as parents, you get busy with the day to day, and then you're just kind of like strangers passing in the night because you're just so busy. So yeah, just friendship, like hanging out together, enjoying time together, having fun, getting to know each other, asking each other questions, being grateful, expressing gratitude. Those are, basics.
Okay. I love it. Any final words for anyone listening today?
Yeah, just be aware of the 4 horsemen, but don't freak out about them, because you're going to notice them. Once you start to be aware of them, you'll notice them. And that's excellent. If you're noticing them, that means you can have a choice to do things differently. So that's a good thing.
Okay. And where can people connect with you, Suzette, and find you?
Yeah, I have a website, SuzetteHaltermanCoaching.com. And then I'm active on Instagram, Suzette Halterman. I put a lot of Gottman research findings on there, different marriage therapists kind of quotes, resources, books about just helping people navigate differences, and just, which is all couples are navigating differences. Yeah. So, yeah.
Amazing. Okay. Check out Suzette, connect with her. She has some great stuff, and I've loved learning from her. Thank you for being here today and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you. It was fun.